On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. To discover the best in events and performances, visit blumenthalarts.org.
You can't compensate for anything. You can't fix it. You can't repair yourself of those wounds in a direct way. You can only do it by actually converting your sorrow into beauty. There's something very profound about that. That's what I think almost all great art is about, is really basically this kind of thing of like, I'm turning my sorrow into beauty. Schubert said something about like, people think this is such a lovely song, they have no idea what grief it came from. And that's really, really true. But then when you do that, it also, you overcome your own sorrow.
Phillip Larrimore is a visual artist who explores that which is between painting and sculpture and realism and abstraction. His most recent work is creating multi-layered paintings on aluminum screens that he shapes into various forms. His paintings have been shown at many exhibits, including at the Gaston County Museum and CPCC Sensoria. Phillip is also an essayist, an art critic, and a poet. He has written extensively for Charlotte Viewpoint and the Charlotte Observer on literature, theater, music, and opera. His artistry extends to botany and designing hundreds of gardens. In this episode, we explore appearance, disappearance, and reappearance in life and art. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Phillip, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me here.
Phillip, you are many things. You're a writer, a poet, a critic, a visual artist. You have had a videography company. You've covered dance. You're a gardener. How do you think of yourself?
I think of myself as kind of a translator between mediums. I'm always thinking about what the analogy between, say, a musical form is with a visual form and finding its relationship to a poetic form. There's always a play going on there. I'm happiest, easiest with painting. Poetry haunts me. It follows me around, doesn't leave me alone, wakes me up in the middle of the night. That's another thing. It's a much more contentious relationship. Writing is a different matter altogether. I think there's always there's a relationship between the things that I'm trying to find, but it's elusive to me a lot of the time.
Is there a message that you're trying to translate?
I think they're messages, plural. In painting, I'm very much interested in appearance and reappearance and disappearance and something apparitional that takes place in art. That's very important to me, but I'm discovering that I'm actually been writing a lot of poems about things coming out of the mist, and that's kind of what happens in my paintings. Things appear and then disappear because of the way I structure them. I would say that's more a metaphor for how I feel things come to all of us, that we have these fleeting epiphanies that are not permanent. We have these moments of realization. You know, Dante starts when he sees a 9-year-old girl. He's 10 years old, and something about him starts his soul up, right? That's a strange appearance out of nowhere, isn't it? These kinds of things are always going on with us. So the great Russian poet Mandelstam said that what a poet is always trying to do is to hold the fleeting moment in a form of crystallization. That would be something that a painter tries to do in a different way. I don't want to make an excessive claim for myself in this matter. I think this is what happens a lot in the act of making art, is that somebody's trying to actually bring a perception into a form. And they're trying to do it because they're trying to keep it, in a way, from death or from oblivion or from something. And they're trying to make something that they can actually pass beyond their own threshold into the future. So that's going on all the time in art, as it should be. I mean, that's what it's for. And there's also the transfiguration of your experience into a form, right? Which is very, very... How do you do that? I'm primarily a visual artist who writes, and everything issues from that. And that's not uncommon. I mean, there are poems by Paul Klee, for example, and Jean Arp, and the back and forth seems to be less bizarre now than it was when I was a younger man. We're having many more poet-writers, artists, than we did, say, 20 years ago when we were supposed to be more specialized. Now everyone's more intermedial.
Talk to me about the visual art that you create. What is it that we would see when we encounter your work?
You would see a number of paintings lined up in front of each other, all of them on aluminum screening, creating a kind of hologram-like image. Or you would see something which reflected one image into another, because I also use mirror. Or you would see my most recent work, which is done with metal boxes, which are made of perforated metal, which can be viewed 22 or 27 different angles to form different kinds of paintings. So everything I do creates illusion, everything I do changes, and everything I do appears, disappears, and reappears. I think appearance is very apparitional. I think that we're always constructing and reconstructing the world. When I'm using something like this layering technique I use, I'm trying to get people to decode things or to see things and how they construct something and how an image then can be reconstructed from another angle and yet another angle and another angle. The ethical reason behind it very much is about seeing that there's not one picture, but that there are many pictures, and that many pictures can actually form many different kinds of realities.
One of the projects that you're working on now is called The 99 Names of Allah. Tell us about that project.
A few years ago, I realized I could actually think 360 degrees, which means that from the front of the brain to the back of the brain and around. And I've been using a lot of different visualization techniques for many years, but all of a sudden I had an exponential change in this. And I was able to see in a very different way. And then I was looking for a format. And I realized that if I were to make a box inside a box inside a box, each of which could be seen through into the next box, that I could make a kind of image of this 360-degree thinking. Then I realized that box inside box inside box, all of it made of aluminum screening or perforated metal, was very much like the newer verse in the Quran, which describes a temple with a niche with a lamp inside it. And I thought to myself, comes very close to my earlier practice of Sufism. I've always wanted to do the 99 Names of Allah. This new 360-degree format is the way to go about it. So that's how.
What is the religious reference or the contextual reference for those who are unfamiliar with the 99 Names of Allah?
There are supposedly more than 99 names, but there are 99 names which are kind of official, and each of them has different attributes. So that the big name is Allah, but then there's Ya Fatah, which means the opener of the heart. There's Ya Wahhab, which means the bestower. There's one for the sight, there's one for hearing, there's one for each of the different names, different attributes of God as they were codified in the Quran. And each of them has a kind of immemorial power to them. It's very, very interesting. it's very interesting as a Westerner to encounter Islam because it's so completely different from my basic thought base. I've been studying Arabic recently, and I've been having to write from right to left. That's very, very different from writing from left to right, the way we do. Whenever you encounter any other religion, it's a little bit like that. You have to almost completely, it really topples your way of thinking altogether. If you are actually successfully encountering it, you can always have a certain anthropological distance, but when you encounter the reality of another religion, it's a very deep and almost searing thing. So how does that play with your own earlier religious basis, and how does it play with your own question about all religions and their relationship to, say, scientific reality? Right? It becomes a very, very intricate field of series of questions.
Have you created 99 boxes?
I've done 10 models using Islamic geometry in a couple of cases, and I've done the schematics for another 50. I'm looking for the funding now, so which is one reason I want to talk about it. And also because I want to use, most of my work has been done very, very privately. I've been very reclusive, but this is the work I want to bring to the public because I feel that I derived a great deal of beauty in my encounter with this other religion, and I feel that somehow bringing a dialogue around it, around different various religions, not just Islam, but also Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism, would be a very good thing right now.
Do you create each box with the name in mind?
Yes, and I'm asking myself, I'm one of the things I want to do with especially the Islamic community is to discuss what their feelings are about each of these different names, because they do have very, very distinct flavors. And I'm finding in the Islamic connections with the Islamic doctrines of light, a lot of relationship to Judaism and Christianity, incidentally, which is something which completely fascinates me. But I also kind of want to underscore where there are parallels. I'm also finding some in Hinduism. So this is very important to me because I feel we're at this particular place spiritually where we've got to figure out that each of these religions is an instrument of truth, but the universe is larger than any of these instruments of truth. And that in order to be able to actually explore the universe, we're going to have to use all of these instruments of truth. So the doctrines of light in the Zohar, in the Judaic study of the Kabbalah, is a very, very rich field for a visual artist. The doctrines of light in the Upanishads, especially the Chandogaya Upanishad, is very, very profound. If you're a visual artist, all of a sudden you go, wow. And then there are all sorts of wonderful relationships between the geometry of the medieval buildings and those of mosque architecture. So all these things I want to bring in.
Philip, as I listen to you talk about universal truths that are greater than any specific religion and how that inspires visual artistry, I think of William Blake.
Oh, absolutely. He's one of my cherished crackpots. Blake was very great. I feel like my early paintings, in many ways, were very much trying to reconcile Turner with Blake. That I wanted that atmospheric vastness that you find in Turner, but I also wanted that kind of constant pressing against the third eye that you find in William Blake. Blake said something which shocked me terribly when I was a child. He said that unless you see it in your own eye, in your own inner eye, as strongly as you do the external reality, it's not a true vision. And gradually, by meditation, I gradually learned how to be able to do what Blake demanded. But if Blake hadn't given me that weird little demand at that particular time, I might have wasted a lot of time. So he's very inspiring. I'm also very fascinated with Blake when you're looking at the prophetic books of all the little vignettes.
And he's a poet as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say he's the great example of the artist, painter, poet. I think Blake's illustrations for Dante are the greatest. With Botticelli is a pale second, and most of the other great illustrations are from 600 years before Blake, 500 years.
And so distinctive. They're instantly recognizable and different than any other work.
And there's something about the choreography of a Blake that's very fascinating to me. And not only to me, but I remember talking with the choreographer Mark Morris, who got a lot of ideas from Blake, as a dancer, right? I remember looking at one of his dances and going, oh, he got that from Blake's Glad Day. So Blake has a very I think if you try to sound like Blake, you end up sounding like a perfect fool. But I think that if you let him be a nutrient, so he's very profound. I did a strange painting which was very, very, for me, very realistic, of the ruins of St. Etienne, that after it was bombed out in World War II. It was right smack in the middle of all the worst fighting. And here's a medieval cathedral that got bombed out. And I wanted to use it for a project I was working on, because I wanted to show my sense of the Christian church as something that really basically had been bombed out and ruined in many ways. But what was behind it was Blake. There was a little vignette in America Prophecy which shows a boat, which is also a tomb, which also has wings on it. It's kind of a little bit like a shroud ship or something very strange and mysterious. And for some reason, that little vignette became the touchstone for this particular painting of this bombed-out cathedral. I don't think anybody would see William Blake in that particular painting, but he was very much there for me as I was doing it.
Philip, I want to talk more about this connection you just made between choreography and visual art. That seems fascinating to me. Talk me through your thinking when you make that connection.
The placement of figure is extremely important in painting if you're doing figurative painting. There was a really bad French miniaturist who finished up the Debris Hours, and he did all the saints going into heaven, but he did them so their halos were at the backs, and basically somebody compared it to looking like a sack of newly minted coins. That's what happens if you don't know how to place the body right in a painting. Blake is fascinating because the torque that is in the bodies, he gets that from Michelangelo. Daumier gets something from Michelangelo. That they're all great choreographers of the human body on the page. Of course, if you put the dancer behind the chorus line, you're not going to see them, right? So placement is very important. I learned a lot about placing plants from choreography. How a tree would unfold became to me like a very, very, very slow form of choreography, if I can put it that way, like a vegetable choreography. Whereas when Mark Morris was thinking about Blake and Glad Day, he was thinking exactly what kind of thing was coming up from the toes, through the pelvis, up through the shoulders, and onto the face. If an artist does not have the presence of something of our physical proportion in their work, nobody's interested in it. We're always looking for it.
That brings us back to the 99 Names of Allah. As you think of these boxes within boxes that are on these screens that you're painting on, is there any element of choreography in that work, since there are no figures that one would see?
Yes, because the box will change as you're walking around it. So you become the dancer, which is very much my intention. And I know when somebody's looking at one of my big paintings that they get it because they start walking around it and they start kind of trying to peer in and trying to figure it out. And everyone figures it out differently. And that figuring out part is very much a part of the process for me. It's why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it, because I'm trying to create a kind of interesting puzzle which everyone can solve in an individual way. An architect does it all the time. An architect's always asking themselves, how can they get someone to go from up the stairs without like bumping into the wall, right? And how to make a doorway inviting as opposed to repellent, and all those different things. I think painters do it to some degree naturally. If you look at a great Manet, it will actually change from angle to angle, even though it's on canvas. But I'm doing it very consciously by taking the visual components apart and making you put them back together again.
You are creating these three-dimensional works of art. What's fascinating to me as I talk to you, though, is that you're mindful of how the viewers are going to physically encounter the work, and that you're intentional about moving them as a choreographer would plan the steps of a dancer. So you're mindful of how the viewer encounters the work?
Yes, to a degree, but there's something I can't govern, which is somebody else's attention span. Right? If somebody is highly analytical, they will be looking at it in a different way from somebody who has a very short attention span, obviously. Mm-hmm. If somebody is interested in how things are put together, they'll be more interested in my work than they will be if they're not.
Let me push this point a little bit, because you began by saying that you're mindful of the viewer as the figure that you are choreographing. Do you really care about the viewer?
Years ago, I heard a wonderful composer named Pauline Oliveras, whose work, she died last year, and I deeply mourn her. She did a very interesting thing with music. She worked with something called the New Sound Foundation, and she played an accordion, but she didn't play it like polka music. She played these long washes of sound. But with the acoustical equipment of the New Sound Foundation, she was able to change the acoustical space that we were in, so that at one moment you felt like you were listening to the sound she was making in a space that was like a Romanesque cathedral. And then another moment, it would feel a little bit like you were listening to it in a French salon with all the brasseries, kind of hard, shiny sound. I remember when she finished playing, and this was in San Francisco in 1992, everyone was silent for about 5 minutes after she stopped, because they had been hearing things in a way they never had before. I'm hoping, as a visual artist, that I can present a series of things that make you see how you see in a way you've never seen before, very much the way Pauline was making me hear. Her work has deeply affected me. I think that my capacity for meditating now was very much deepened by that experience of that acoustical sound changing the way it did. So I would like to do that for people visually. So yes, the viewer is very important to me, because I'm trying to show them how I construct my sight, and maybe that's something that we have in common.
If the 99 names of Allah were fully realized as an exhibit, how do you imagine it?
99 boxes floating in space, each of them different, and each of them kind of creating a kind of syntoptic effect, so that you feel that you've learned something as you are passing or looking through them. I've always wanted to do a work with an arc, a large-scale arc, like the Goldberg variations of Bach, which basically is almost everything you could possibly do in counterpoint in music. And I would kind of like to do that with the idea of the circle and the square, which is what these pieces are about. That's the basis of all geometry. And all Hindu architecture is based on a grid. Islamic architecture is based on a circle and a grid, which it derives from the Pantheon in Rome, and then it became the Hagia Sophia, which then became, after Islam took over Turkey, right, it became like the model for the mosque, which then filtered all through different things and became that. So the mosque architecture is very important to me, because I think in Islam and in Christianity both, you have the idea of a building as a symbol of God, a symbol of entering the divine. You enter the divine. And in synagogue architecture, too, insofar as we know about it. I mean, like, there are no really great histories of it yet. But the proportions of these things are actually all related and all holy. That's why they call it sacred geometry as opposed to simple geometry.
Are there other artists who also paint on these screens the way that you do?
I'm always hearing about somebody who's supposed to do something like what I do, and then I look at it and I go, that's not what I do. But if there are, more power to them. It's a difficult technique because you have to have a lighter brush hand than you can possibly have on canvas. A couple of people have asked me if they could borrow the technique, and they've given up just because basically they can't. Their brush hand is not light enough. The other thing is, how do you structure things? So if you would imagine that, say, on a 4-layer piece, the back might act like the skeleton, and then the second might act like the muscular system, and the one closer to you might act like the arterial system, and then the third, and then the last might act like the skin. You'd have an idea. Or another way of saying it might be like the back acts like the bass, then the tenor part, then the alto, and then the soprano. At any point, all those parts have to interweave. How do you get them to interweave from a number of different angles? How do you get something that's coherent? That's actually very tricky. And how do you get something that yields something new every time you look at it? That's the big challenge there, too. I mean, I've seen some people do very minimalist things with this, but I'm very maximalist. My work is very, very, very... Each of those paintings, the back painting, has to be a beautiful painting, a great painting, before I go on to the next one. So if you're looking at 4 paintings, you're looking at 4 paintings I hope are wonderful if they were taken apart. And that's the only way to really make it work. If you do something simplified as the back painting, or if your skeleton's no good, then the rest of the painting will be no good.
Phil, let's talk about your life. Where did you grow up?
I grew up, as a little boy, I grew up in Massachusetts, and we moved here to North Carolina, to Tarboro, North Carolina, when I was about 7. Mm-hmm. And that was very unusual and odd for me. I missed the city very much, actually. And I never forgave my parents for coming to the South.
When you say Massachusetts, are you saying Boston?
Mm-hmm.
So your earliest years were in Boston?
Mm-hmm.
And you remember it?
Oh, I do. I remember vividly, and how could I forget it? I have my dad's picture from his office of the Old Testament prophets that was done for the Boston Public Library by John Singer Sargent. And I remember, and Dad had a long photograph of it, which is now in my library, with Moses in the middle and Obadiah and people like that, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all lined up. I was very scared of Obadiah because he was extremely they were all theatrical. I don't think that Sargent in this particular work was deeply into the inner light. I think that his Moses, to me, looks a little bit like an Art Deco skyscraper, now that I'm looking at it. But at the time, when I was a kid, I was very impressed by it.
Brothers or sisters?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and they're all big personalities. Everyone in my family is kind of highly charged in their own way, and interesting in their own particular way. My clever nephew was visiting us at a Thanksgiving. He said that being at the table was like being in one of those Saul Steinberg cartoons where everyone is speaking in a different graphic style. So that somebody over here is speaking in a very highly curlicued manner, and somebody else is speaking in this font over here, the bold font. And I think, well, that's certainly true.
Your dad was a minister.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about growing up as the son of a minister.
It made me extremely critical of religion. I was very, very, very much first like, I was like a little Trotskyite Jewish boy being raised by a Baptist minister. That's what I was like. You know, I like, all I wanted to go out and was put a beret on my head and smoke a chitan and like complain, instead they were hurling me into church, which I deeply resented. But I had to be kind of quiet about it because I didn't want to get crushed.
Can you paint a picture of growing up where you did and what your household was like?
Tarboro is still a pretty little town, which is not, it's kind of in a time warp. I had a paper out. I remember looking at To Kill a Mockingbird and thinking to myself how much like that town ours was, except I was living there in the 1960s, and of course To Kill a Mockingbird was taking place in the 1930s. But it felt that way. I knew all the old ladies who sat on the swings, and they would talk to me about things. And all the librarians kind of adopted me, so it kind of protected me from the bullies at the school, which were always trying to set me afire.
Were you different than the other kids?
Terribly. And it wasn't until the Ouija board told them that I was Edgar Allan Poe reincarnated that I was accepted. And all of a sudden, all my peculiarities became comprehensible to them. And then they started calling me Eddie, like Edgar Allan Poe, and even signing like messages congratulating me on my wonderful writing from my previous incarnation, which the Ouija board had told them. But before that, I was kind of a strange kid. I was strange enough that I felt stranger than I probably seemed to them. Now, looking back on it, I realized that a lot of people loved me. I didn't realize that at the time. And I remember going back to visit the town with my mom and dad when my niece graduated from college 7 years ago or so. And I met this old woman who always used to send my dad a pound cake every birthday and every Christmas, Annette Edwards. And I visited with Annette, and she knew exactly, it was like she had been waiting to see me all those years. So there was that kind of love there too. And I didn't realize it at the time. And now I do. And it's very sweet to me. I spent a lot of time in the cemetery when I was a kid. There was a really odd, beautiful, old Episcopal cemetery, which was basically going back to the colonial times. And I would go to get away from my family, my loud, large family, and walk around in the cemetery and kind of talk to the dead people there. I learned a lot about style in this cemetery, actually, because you could see how the colonial tombs were all kind of narrow, thin, and the letters were worn away. And then they became more and more ostentatious, so by the time you got to the Victorian era, you had these big Victorian bathtubs of tombs with angels all over them that looked scary. I tended to avoid those.
Who were you in high school?
Oh, I went to Tarboro High School, and then I came here when Dad took over the ministry at Monroe. I didn't last here very long at all. I had a very vexed relationship with the people. A very dear uncle and aunt invited me, realizing I was basically being hurled down the stairs a lot at Monroe High School, to go up and live with them in Washington, D.C., which saved me. Otherwise, I'd probably be dead.
So you graduated from high school in Washington, D.C.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what happened next?
I got involved with what is called used to be called the Weather Underground. And I left the Corcoran, where I was kind of developing a career, and kind of disappeared because I had the FBI after me. I don't know if we should be talking about this, but you know, it's water under the bridge. And I looked into...
So this places us in the late 60s,
yeah.
67, 68, 69.
69 is when I graduated from high school. I knew all the various people who were part of that group of people. I kind of divorced myself from them when I heard someone talk about how wonderful it was that Sharon Tate had been murdered by Charles Manson. That annoyed me very much. And I thought, you're talking about a young pregnant woman. This is evil. She's not a pig, even though she has money. And it's not good. And it doesn't mean the revolution's coming. This is bad, 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 bad. And I had a dream about Gandhi that same night. And he came to me with tears in his eyes. And I thought to myself, he didn't have to tell me anything. And so I kind of divorced myself from those particular people. I knew a lot of them in California, where they were kind of waiting for a revolution that never took place. I didn't believe in the violence myself. There was a kind of machismo to the idea of violence, but I found myself very unconvinced by that. And I read Nadezhda Mandelstam's memoirs, Hope Against Hope, and I realized that I had some very, very, very difficult times with the left at that particular time. Now I have them with the right, but that's another story altogether. I actually have trouble with ideologues, and I think it comes from that particular time when I had all these people actually speaking a kind of rhetoric which was very unbecoming from people from a middle-class affluent place. They shouldn't have been sounding like they were the newly colonized victims a la Frantz Fanon or something.
You ended up in California.
Yeah, and I ran an odd, rather beautiful shop with my friend Baruch Himmelstein, who was a very sweet Jewish boy who was an aspiring artist, but we both became interested in botany. And that's when I started studying plants. We're talking about 1972 or 3. So we ran a very successful shop in North Beach and then at the Henry Adams Design Center, which specialized in cacti and orchids. And I knew all the old cactus dealers in California at that time and all the orchid people, who were very different types, by the way. You know, when you go to a dog show and everyone has a dog that looks like their haircut, the plant people are like that too. So all the cactus people are very prickly and very like, and if you don't know the botanical names, they'll shoot you down. But the orchid people are very kind of, hey man, and they're kind of orchidaceous, if I can put it that way. Anyway, it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. I also worked for Francis Ford Coppola's City Magazine during that time, and with my crazy friend Ken Kelly, who was considered at one time to be one of the best interviewers, and I knew the people at Rolling Stone. Ken was an amazing interviewer. He interviewed Anita Bryant for Playboy magazine, and he was the person who actually put his coat in front of her when somebody was trying to put a pie in his face. But the truth of the matter was, he was interviewing her to ruin her career, and quite rightly, because she was homophobic and evil as hell. And I edited that interview, which was 500 pages of her ramblings, and I managed to get it down to 50 pages, and the Playboy people got it down to about 30. And I got to meet all sorts of interesting people through Ken. I got Stevie Wonder I got to meet, which was odd, because we talked about colors, which he had never seen. So yes, it was, and this was 1970s when everything was wide open. I actually think that particular period was probably more experimental than the last 30 years. So you were always meeting a new group of people who called themselves something odd, like conceptual artists. I knew a lot of the early conceptual artists who were making really awful stuff. And my shop was in North Beach, so we had all sorts of weird beat poets coming in all the time. One day Allen Ginsberg came in, another day Florence Ferlinghetti came in, and so it was exciting.
Who is Philip Gerard?
That was my nom de guerre when I was underground.
Oh, with the Weathermen.
Mm-hmm. And I kept it until I came back here, actually, because I couldn't get rid of it once I started using it. But I was glad to shed it because it was embarrassing, and I felt like an impersonator. But because I was underground, I didn't have a Social Security number until I was 33 years old. And
but you published under that name, didn't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I published in the New Yorker under that name.
What was the poem in the New Yorker?
It was a little thing, but, I think to myself, what a fool I was. Howard Moss liked me. I could have been I was reading Elizabeth Bishop's correspondence with him. I thought I could have done that if I had been bold enough. One of Ken's friends was the daughter of Alex Liberman, who was the head of all Condé Nast publications. So she was the person who gave Howard Moss my poem. And that's how I got into the New Yorker. Also, I was a little crazy during that time. There was a point where I had to spend about 3 years of my 20s deciding not to go mad. Now, I'm not sure how effective that decision was, but I didn't make it during that time, and I really tried to keep it up. And I ended up reading a tremendous amount of comparative religion at that particular time to find out what was going on with me. And the upshot of it was that I'd never figured out what was actually happening with me, but I ended up learning a lot.
Mm-hmm. The culture there at that time really attracted a lot of people who were on these journeys of personal discovery.
Yes, and then there was also just a great deal of confusion. You know, it's one thing to admire, say, the Inuit shaman poetry, right? It's another thing to try to write that way. And it's another thing to try to adopt the ideas of the shaman, from the Inuit shaman. And so everyone was very confused about exactly where they were coming from at that particular point, because what is their relationship to this other prehistoric way of, say, knowing God, or of having, you know, what is your relationship to that? At this particular time, everyone basically thought in a strange way that they could go do something not quite as extreme as the idea that was going on with the Maoists of starting to build up culture from the bottom up, but they were very much trying to figure out how to completely turn society over. I don't think I miss the 1970s prophets very much, actually, Mark. I mean, they were very, very, there was a great deal of pretension, too, and there was a great deal of undigested things. I underwent a great deal of cultural indigestion for about 10 years. I think that's one reason that it did terrible things to my writing. Now, I can write good, clear prose, but at that particular time, it'd be like every sentence, am I a symbolist? What does this word mean? I also got very much into linguistic difficulties over language itself. What does language convey? What does this mean? Right? Which I read much too much Wittgenstein at that time. So that was antithetical to that whole kind of hyperbolically metaphorical thing that was going on with all of the people who were trying to outlive their experience of psychedelics. I'm glad I came out of it alive.
How long were you in San Francisco?
I was there until 1978. The choreographer Elizabeth Streb, who is a fabulous artist and who was one of my good friends at that time, she basically came to San Francisco to drag me to New York. She decided I should not be there anymore. So I kind of agreed to go and visit, and then I got there and I thought to myself, I don't want to go back. In San Francisco, the landscape, especially the Northern California landscape, almost became like a daily visionary experience. But in New York, the human multitude on the subway became a daily visionary experience. It's like all of a sudden I was moving from the vastness of that Pacific space to the vastness of human space in a confined space. I think I was there at the last great phase of a bohemia in Manhattan. I think that's when punk emerged, and that was when all sorts of interesting things were going on. You couldn't go down the block without seeing a Keith Haring graffito painting on the wall.
Where did you live?
I lived first at Elizabeth Streb's studio, which was on Canal Street, and I believe she still has a studio in the adjoining building now, which is rare. And then I moved in. Baruch showed up. He'd found a synagogue on 8th and B. So I had this whole huge old synagogue in right next to Tompkins Square, which was a mixed blessing because Tompkins Square at that time was considered to be Needle Park, so there were junkies always shooting up. And I remember watching them shoot up during a snowstorm from my big windows in the old synagogue.
You mentioned earlier that you had met Merce Cunningham and John Cage, and you re-encountered them in New York.
Yes, I started a dance documentary thing with my friend Michael Schwartz, who was a dancer, who was the first dancer to work with Elizabeth. We were all friends from California. Michael was very, very good at knowing exactly how to focus on what was going on stage because of his dance background. So I learned a great deal from him. The company became kind of the state-of-art company for choreographers to go to, and then the Rockefeller Foundation asked us to start documenting stuff for them. So for something called the National Choreography Project, I worked with the Dia Art Foundation, and we did the first things for PBS of Elizabeth Streb's work, but also for Tricia Brown, who just died last year, who was one of the great choreographers of all time as well. I got to interview Merce, and we became friends at that particular time again.
For those who are not familiar with Merce Cunningham and John Cage, who are they historically? What's their importance and significance?
I'd say that John opened up everybody's mind to the musicality of existence, as opposed to the idea that music should be a narrative structure, like a Beethoven sonata. John profoundly influenced that composer I mentioned to you, Pauline Oliveira. She was actually one of probably his best pupil. But he was a huge influence on music all through the 1940s until his death in the 1990s, and continues to be. Merce took dance into directions that had been started by Balanchine, but he took them in directions whereby the form was profoundly expanded by him taking it apart and putting it back together again in ways that never had been done before. And as far as I'm concerned, maybe Tricia Brown or Elizabeth Streb are the only choreographers who represent any kind of development since Merce. I used to know Edwin Denby, who's considered to be the greatest dance critic. And we used to talk periodically, and he said to me that he thought that Merce Cunningham was a greater choreographer than Balanchine. Now, what's significant about that is that Edwin was the greatest critic to ever write about Balanchine's work. And he could actually bring, in his words, the dance before your eyes. So if he said that Merce was that great, then maybe he was.
Merce and John were partners.
Mm-hmm.
Were you friends with them both?
I knew Merce better. I only had peripheral encounters with John, which were very charming and funny. And I remember something he said about the partner thing. He said, oh, yes, he was being interviewed. He said, oh, yes, I'm in a homosexual relationship, and that means that I cook and he does the dishes. The influence of chance operations, which is the big thing with Cage, was very important because there's something about every artist after a certain point needs to do what Picasso said, break your hand, which means that there are some things that become too easy for you, and so there are some things that if you do them one more time, it's rote. So John had a way of breaking things up and making them non-rote by devious means. He used the I Ching, for example, so that if it would tell you which section to use against another section. And when Merce did a piece of choreography, often his dancers wouldn't know what they were going to do before they went on stage, and he'd say, we're going to be doing part of this dance over here, next to this part of this over here, and this part of this over here. It caused a tremendous amount. They had to really be on point, and they had to be very fresh. Merce could also build tableaus or physical statues, as it were, or strange combinations in a way that took something profound from Balanchine. Balanchine sometimes, Apollon Musajet, right, the first great Balanchine ballet, there's this wonderful thing that takes place where the three muses become kind of a chariot, and Apollo's doing that. Merce took that chariot much further. And it's something that also happens in popular choreography. There's a certain point in Chicago, right, the musical, where all of a sudden all the dancers kind of become a Rolls Royce. So it's not so odd as it sounds when you start thinking about people doing that. But Merce could put bodies together and make them do interesting things. You might string 5 bodies together, and it would look like a Nam Gabo or an art sculpture. I mean, it would be like, I didn't know people could do that. And that gave something tremendous to choreography. Pilobolus, which is always doing odd things with, everyone's kind of turning into sea urchins or crustaceans or polyps at the bottom of the ocean, right? That's indirectly from Merce, I think.
Philip, you've talked about in other conversations that you left New York for a reason, that the AIDS crisis began in the 1980s, and that you lost many friends, and that marked you and was a burden. And I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, it's odd. Right now, I have all these former enemies of mine as friends on Facebook. And the reason we're friends now is because we all survived that time. And we're the last thing standing. But during that time, I lost maybe 125 people in a period of a year or so. It was like every time I answered the phone, it was more bad news. I lost a lot of people. It was very exhausting. I ended up turning into a caregiver, and it left me with a great sense of emotional exhaustion, and it took about 8 to 10 years for me to get over the sense of extreme depression from it. I had to fight against my own desire and my own survival guilt and my own questioning about what's the use of doing anything, because when you lose a lot of people, that's what happens to you. Right now in this world, there are all these people who are Syrian or who are Yemeni or who are parts of Rwanda who have undergoing what I underwent, except they're undergoing it in a much more graphic way by people getting murdered. So this happens to human beings a great deal. Holocaust survivors, I'm always amazed at how, when I meet somebody who's been a Holocaust survivor, usually I've been astonished at their extreme moral transparency. Something happens when you've undergone something really terrible and survived it. But it's also the fact that they are actually able to be cheerful and humane is a remarkable achievement. So I had to work in my own way to become cheerful and humane again myself. Or cheerful and humane in a new way, I should say. That was very difficult, but my deep belief is you have to use everything that happens. You have to use it, otherwise you're used by it. And it took me a long time to do that. I gradually started becoming the eyes and the ears of my lost ones. I started basically seeing for them. And when Dad died last year, that was very, it was a little bit like, now I see something beautiful. It belongs to us both. So that's one way.
What year did you return to North Carolina?
1994. And it was odd. I found it to be very, things have changed a great deal here for me. I have a lot of people I know and love. At that particular time, I'd lost all the people I knew and loved. So it was a very different period of my life. So there was about a period of 4 or 5 years where I was really having to dig it out of myself. And then the joy came back into work. And I also realized that when you survive, and many have died, you have a kind of responsibility to do your best. You have to, there's something you really must really, you can't compensate for anything. You can't fix it. You can't repair yourself of those wounds in a direct way. You can only do it by actually converting your sorrow into beauty. There's something very profound about that. That's what I think almost all great art is about, is really basically this kind of thing of like, I'm turning my sorrow into beauty. Schubert said something about people think this is such a lovely song, they have no idea what grief it came from. And that's really true. But then when you do that, you overcome your own sorrow.
Does art require melancholia?
I've been asking myself that because I think to myself, I don't really want to turn every painting into a bipolar operation where I'm overcoming this black depression in order to be able to do this beautiful thing. That seems to me to be like a little thankless. But yes, it does. I think that it's a desperate means. You're trying to figure out how to change the world, and you realize that the only tool you have is your own imagination and its ability of that imagination to take form. That's the only real, that's the only way that I can change things. And I think most artists feel kind of, in a strange way, humbled by the difficulty of it. So, in a strange way, there's an element of desperation to making art at all, I believe. I think anyone who makes art is a little bit on a precipice. However, I've also decided that everyone's crazy. Everyone's totally, absolutely stark raving mad. Everybody. There are a few strange, sensible people, but they're only decoys, right? Everyone else is crazy. Artists are crazy, but they make something. As long as you're making something, there's some possibility you can save your soul.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Mark.
Phillip Larrimore is a visual artist who explores that which is between painting and sculpture and realism and abstraction. He is an essayist, an art critic, poet, and designer of gardens. Phillip studied at the Corcoran School of Art and Design. And now, a personal word. Sometimes in an interview, one misses the obvious because the obvious is hidden in plain sight. There is a scene at the end of the movie The Usual Suspects when a character with cerebral palsy named Verbal Kint, played by the actor Kevin Spacey, is being interrogated by a detective in a police station. Behind the detective are random news clippings on a crowded bulletin board. Kint tells a story about a legendary crime figure named Kaiser Soze. As the scene plays out, we realize that Kint's entire story was pieced together from details on the bulletin board. Kint leaves the police station, gradually dropping his limp and flexing his supposedly palsied hand. It dawns on us that Kint is in fact Kaiser Soze, hiding in plain sight. I think of Phillip Larrimore as hiding in plain sight. Here are the clues on the bulletin board. He says his art is about appearance, disappearance, and reappearance. His poetry is about what comes out of the mist. When he was young, he hid from his family in cemeteries, and classmates called him Eddie. He left the Corcoran School, joined the Weather Underground, and assumed the identity of Philip Gerard. In his 40s, he reclaimed his birth name and reappeared in North Carolina. He produces his work in private for months at a time and reappears occasionally to show what he has produced. Here are the many questions I didn't ask Philip. Why did he leave the Corcoran School to join the Weather Underground? How long was he with the Weather Underground? What did he do for the Weather Underground? Was he an anarchist? A spy? Why did he change his identity? How did he live without a social security number for nearly 20 years? What was it like caring for people dying of AIDS? Did he lose someone he particularly loved? What happened to his friend and business partner, Baruch Himmelstein? What has it been like to live as an adult with his parents? What sustains his caregiving of his parents? How did his father's death affect him? What connection is there between his caregiving and his art? What does he believe about manifestations of God? There's so much mystery about Philip. But what is in plain sight is that Philip is the art he creates, and the art he creates is him. Multi-layered, abstract, shape-shifting, shadow-casting, referential, between, betwixt, seasonal, perennial, apparitional. Philip may not be Kaiser Soze, but he is an artist who is here to whom we must pay attention. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my partners Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value. Visit us also on our website on lifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.